Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Morena. I thank Helen and Kate for inviting me to speak to you today, and I hope you can hang in there and not walk out partway through. It will not be scientific, I assure you. We could talk about creation as the Big Bang, but I shall leave that to Professor Brian Cox and the astrophysicists. Or we could talk about creation as the evolution of the species, and I shall leave that to Richard Dawkins and the other biologists. Or we could marvel at all the creatures of the land and the sea and the sky, and I shall leave that to David Attenborough. So instead, I'm going to share a personal story. Some people are fortunate enough to have an epiphany. Dr. Google defines epiphany as a moment of sudden and great revelation or realization. I've had just 2 epiphanies in my life. The first one was when I was born during a snowstorm, and I discovered what a magical world it was, but I don't remember that one very well. The second one was in 2005, that's about 14 years ago. I was starting to read scientific studies about environmental issues when I suddenly realized there was a black cloud on the horizon that would change everything. Scientists were calling it global warming, which means an increase in the surface temperature of the globe. The predicted consequences of this were frankly alarming. I realized that I could no longer assume that I would live out my life in relative comfort, and my children and grandchildren would suffer terribly and might not even survive to my age. If the scientists were right, I would have to change my expectations and my comfortable lifestyle. And that epiphany I remember very well. After this epiphany followed despondency. I couldn't see the way ahead, and it felt like a heavy burden. Furthermore, hardly anybody was talking about it, so I felt quite alone. The Swedish schoolgirl, Greta Thunberg, who's been mentioned several times from the pulpit, had a similar experience when she was just 15 years old. She became aware of climate change caused by global warming, and she realized that this was incredibly important, but nobody seemed to care. The leaders in her society in Sweden were not even talking about it. Then she became depressed. She stopped talking and even stopped eating for a while. After this epiphany came despondency and action. Greta skipped school for 3 weeks and sat down outside the Swedish Parliament to protest government inaction on climate change. Then other people joined her. And then the politicians started to listen. On March 15 this year, an estimated 1.4 million students in 112 countries throughout the world joined her call to protest government inaction on climate change. Greta has become a world leader at 16 years old now, influencing even the United Nations. Though I must say some of the United Nations delegates refused to listen to her. So one determined person can make a difference. The students will be striking again next month, and they have invited us all to join them. I hope some of you do. It's a very interesting experience. Closer to home, way back in August 2006, 13 years ago, a group of us ran a workshop in the cathedral on climate change with support from the Dean and the Royal Society. We had 5 expert speakers in the morning and practical sessions in the afternoon. It was well attended, although not everybody was up with the play. I met one person who came along to hear about weather forecasting. I think she was disappointed. The next year, a group of Anglicans came together and formed the Diocesan Climate Change Action Group. Our mission was to help Anglicans to reduce their carbon emissions in order to help to slow down climate change, not prevent it. A few weeks later, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a technical report called AR4, This collated a great deal of scientific evidence on climate change, made our case that much more credible. Since that time, our Anglican group has given educational workshops on climate change throughout the diocese. We have persuaded the Three Tikanga Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand, to divest from fossil fuels and to offset its carbon emissions from clergy travel. We have provided energy audits of church buildings. We have worked intensively within one rural parish to encourage sustainable living practices. In July, we made submissions to the Environmental Select Committee on the Zero Carbon Bill. This is just a very small start, and there is far more that needs to be done. So we had epiphany, despondency, and some action. But what about hope? Is there really any hope that we can avoid climate catastrophe? Or have we locked it in? Have we left it too late for our children and grandchildren and ourselves? Well, yes and no. I see a number of hopeful signs, and I want to focus on the good ones today. First of all, the world is waking up at last. Thousands of the world's scientists who study the land, the oceans, and the atmosphere have made it very clear that we have a climate crisis and we're heading towards catastrophe if we don't take drastic action right now. There can be no doubt that we humans have caused this by burning coal, oil, and gas and cutting down the forests that store carbon. As you probably know, a huge amount of deforestation is happening in Brazil and Indonesia right now. Secondly, many secular groups have sprung up, determined to spur governments into action. In New Zealand, we have, just to name a few, Generation Zero, young people who initiated the Zero Carbon Bill. We have 350, Coal Action, Forest and Bird, the Green Party, Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, Youth for Climate, and so on. These are mostly young people, not all, but mostly. On Thursday, an influential group of doctors and other health professionals stood outside Parliament to support their submission on the Zero Carbon Bill. Here in Auckland, a professor of population health has been speaking at international conferences on the impact of climate change on health. In a quiet way, he's been influencing the world. But what about politics and business? Is anybody listening? Yes, there were about 1,500 submissions to the Select Environment Committee on the Zero Carbon Bill. There has, of course, been some understandable pushback from the agricultural sector and the fossil fuel and automobile industries. But it has cross-party support. I'm fairly confident that it will go into legislation in one form or another. We already have incentives for public transport, for more efficient vehicles, and there's a growing interest in plant-based diets and a corresponding changes in agriculture. The world is changing very rapidly abroad and starting to change in New Zealand. Auckland Council and others have declared a climate emergency. Some major institutions are trying to function more sustainably, and many of them have divested from fossil fuels. But what about the church? Do we care enough about our world and our future, and those of our children and grandchildren, to take action? One of our mission statements is care of creation, and another one is social justice. I've mentioned our Auckland group. In Wellington Diocese, a young woman has been appointed by the bishop to work on climate justice. She has the energy and the passion that are required. Throughout the country, there is an ecumenical network of Christian churches learning from each other. This includes Anglican, Catholic, Baptist, Salvation Army, and many others. General Synod is planning to appoint a climate commissioner for the church with a focus on Tikanga Pacifica, because that is where the impact of climate change is being felt right now in the Pacific. After church next Sunday, we shall be having a practical workshop right here at St Matthew's on the actions we can take personally to reduce our carbon footprint and live more sustainably. It will be informal and interactive. I hope some of you can come. So there is some hope, but it's not wishful thinking. It comes about through commitment and action. We don't have to despair, as some young people are. And we don't have to carry the whole burden ourselves, but we have work to do. So what can we do in practice? The scientists tell us we must put the world on a war footing in order to prevent climate catastrophe. It's not too late, but we must take this very seriously right now. So, for Christians, the starting point is that good old-fashioned word, repentance. That doesn't mean sitting around getting gloomy. Repentance is about changing our behaviour. The most important thing we can do is to reduce our consumption. As Quakers say, live simply so that others may simply live. The others are our children and our grandchildren. In our workplaces and our places of leisure and our homes and churches, we can influence others by our words and actions. Professor James Renwick, a well-known, well-established New Zealand climate scientist, says that we must talk about it. If it's swept under the carpet, nobody does anything. Of course, we'll have more credibility if we've started to make changes in our own lives. We can support many of the secular groups that are working to change government policy. Prepare to be surprised and uplifted by the thousands of young people in our nation who are working to preserve their future. They need and they welcome our support. If we show that support, they will take us more seriously. At the local and regional level, we can get informed and vote for the candidates with policies that support our environment. We have a great opportunity next month with the local body elections. At a national level, we need to stop oil and gas exploration immediately, phase out the burning of coal for electricity generation and drying milk powder, stop dairy conversions, reduce the intensity of beef and dairy farming, plant far more trees to absorb carbon, and much, much more. We city people need to reduce our air travel. Do we really need to travel to Europe? Reconsider our local transport and our retail shopping habits. Reconsider our food, our use of energy, our waste disposal, and our use of water. We shall be addressing some of these issues after church next Sunday. Come if you have the courage. We must also act collectively. Research tells us that transformational change comes about when networked individuals work together. As Christians, we are already members of a community of people of goodwill. We don't need to create a new community. We are not alone, and as Wilf will remind us in half an hour, the Spirit of God is alive in the land. So from epiphany to despondency, to action, to hope, and finally to leadership. Here's my challenge today. Could we at St Matthew's lead the Auckland Diocese in sustainable living practices? Could we become known as the Green Church on the Edge? Are we ready to change our personal and community behaviours? And 5 years from now, could we be known as the church that faced up to the existential challenges of our time? We could be known as kaitiaki, custodians of the land and the oceans and the atmosphere. It's up to us. Amen.